The metropolitan, egalitarian, sort of New Age Syria has still few problems when it comes to respecting their minorities, whether it be sort of the group minorities, and I'm using that sort of in quotation marks for people who are listening to this on a podcast, or the actual individuals. They still are having trouble. Like they keep killing them, or they keep trying to go after them. Different militias try to go after. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on the Druze communities in the south of Syria, sort of like south of Damascus, and also in some I believe in some neighborhoods in Damascus, there's also big Druze population. And there is violence being committed against those communities, despite what the government has promised, despite the fact that we are already, and by we I mean sort of the Western world is already trying to sanction the new Syrian regime. I mean, you have the European Union and some European states basically trying to relieve some of the sanctions, especially on humanitarian aid, and to try to possibly help the new regime. I'm not sure if this already started, but you also had the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, sort of already trying to see if they can provide some funds to this newly emerging state. You have even the American administration basically saying, hey, Syria could be another sort of signatory to the Abraham Accords, which is the initiative started by Trump during his first administration for countries to normalize relations with Israel. And, Syria could be another one. Syrian president has sort of signaled that, he wants just peace, he wants to. But when we look at his actions, I mean, we had one episode where we went through the new constitution of Syria, which I think is laughable to even call that thing a constitution. It's pretty much enabling act, similar to Hitler's enabling act, which basically just gives all the power to one person to do whatever he wants. And yeah, there are some sort of institutions set up that are completely controlled by president. But yeah, so we have that. We have attacks on Druze communities. We also have basically now Israel is targeting parts of, as it was in the past, it now is also targeting parts of Syria, basically trying to prevent this from happening. And you even had the Jewish communities within Israel basically really pushing for government to do something, since they are very connected to them. Welcome to the Daily Objective. That's what we're going to be discussing today in a bit deeper form. Joining me today is James Valiant. And yeah, go to you, James. We were supposed to do this topic yesterday, but something bigger happened. But I think this is still a topic that we'll probably continue focusing on, specifically Syria. We might have someone from the Jewish communities, hopefully in the upcoming days, to come on the show. So that would be great to talk about. But yeah, James, I mean, let's start with sort of the question we always ask ourselves: what is this quick sort of? We cannot wait to sort of legitimize Syria's regime. We cannot wait to make sure, these guys are different. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were in Al Qaeda. They were allied with Al Qaeda. But come on, that was like 5 years ago. Like, come on.
Uh, that is really the point here. The international community would embrace dictatorships and have embraced dictatorships and support and recognize dictatorships. Dictatorship is not a problem for the international community. A theocratic dictatorship would not be a problem for the international community. It would not. We've seen that in case after case after case. But there is no substitute for liberal values, for freedom of religion. In the United States, we have the first line of our Bill of Rights says no establishment of religion, period. That's it. We can have no official religion in America. It is a secular government. Now, I don't expect that from other countries, but we can demand and expect that they treat all religious groups with respect and have the same freedom as everyone else. In one of these cases, a Druze leader said something, just south of Damascus, said something that the Sunni majority found to be blasphemous against the prophet, and that set off the Sunni militia coming into a Druze area and attacking innocent Druze people, and civilians were killed in that. And for Syria, a multi-religious society, to survive and function in any kind of stable way, they need to have built into their constitution religious freedom. If I were a Western country, the leader of a Western country, I would insist on that as part of recognition. If you're going to hold among your cards the capacity to go after blaspheming religious minorities, you are a theocratic dictatorship. If you want Sharia law to be obeyed in all of its particulars by everyone in your country as a matter of law, you are a theocratic dictatorship. And it has such dictatorships are always the cause of war, and they're certainly in the first instance a cause of oppressing religious minorities within the country. And in Syria, it's particularly important because they are a religiously diverse country, and the stability that the Assad regime provided was simply a top-down enforcement of a certain perspective, religious perspective. That is what is wrong with the Middle East today. It does no good when Donald Trump says, separation between church and state, is that a good thing? I don't know. And however cosmetic the changes he was justifying with his questioning of whether the American separation of church and state is a good thing, if we lack that kind of moral understanding in the West about the significance, the central role of freedom of conscience, the central role of freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and freedom of religious practice, if we have lost that, then how can we have the moral authority, the moral spine, the moral backbone to defend the Druze in Syria? What's wrong with the Middle East is precisely that they don't have any kind of separation between their religion and their state. And Druze will suffer. Everyone else who has a variant belief other than the government that's ruling. And of course, it's really reassuring to know that these are al-Qaeda people. What was al-Qaeda all about but religious sectarianism and violence against anyone who disagreed with their violent enforcement of religious sectarianism in the Muslim world? No. And so what can you say? The Syria today is being welcomed because the West is desperate for peace and, as usual, is willing to embrace any kind of dictatorship. We should not, before there is any kind of settlement, stable settlement. As you point out, the current constitution is kind of a joke. What it does is it basically gives the currently appointed, self-appointed rulers of Syria authorization for the next few years to do what it basically likes. To bring stability and order. But look at the leadership, look at the Constitution itself. For all of its, cosmetic, lipstick on a pig stuff about stability and acceptance of different groups and having a diverse, look, see, I've got a diverse cabinet. That won't cut it. That we've seen that won't cut it in Lebanon, for example, where they tried this kind of religious compromise. Okay, you come from this group, you come from this group, and we'll make sure to have enough people from this group over here. Lebanon is, in microcosm, what Syria could be. The old Lebanon, in microcosm, could be what the new Syria becomes. And we cannot allow that to happen. Israel has a direct security interest. It's not just in protecting religious minorities, but bully for them if they, good for them, really on them, insofar as they do protect the Druze minority, which is oppressed and has been oppressed by the Syrian government for quite some time. It's really ironic. In Israel, they call it an apartheid state based on religion. And it's true, there is, in Israel, you don't have separation of total separation of religion and state as we do in the United States. On the other hand, the Druze minority in Israel have rights. Arab Muslims in Israel have rights. They're permitted to be important business people. They're permitted to be in the government. They're permitted to express their opinion. They're permitted to worship as they choose. And Israel should be, in effect, even if you're going to have a official declaration, okay, we're a bunch of Muslim people, and Muhammad, bless his name or whatever, is going to be on your flag. at least build into your constitution what Israel has built into its constitution. That is religious tolerance. We're not going to oppress religious minorities such as the Druze. And we have now seen dozens of people die in sectarian religious violence in southern Syria. It's happening right now. Just this last week, I think it was on Israeli Independence Day, we saw this violence in Syria. That is intolerable. They are continuing in their savage demands for the punishment of religious groups that they don't approve of. That is the essence of what's wrong with the Middle East today.
Yeah, and we have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, when you go to this, I mean, you mentioned Lebanon, and they have this thing like every religion has a specific amount of seats in the parliament, and the prime minister is always from one religious group, but the president is from a different religious group, and I think maybe there's one more position for one religious group of power, and this entrenches this kind of tribalism. This makes sure that basically that are Christian interests in quotation marks. There are Islamic interests, which is ridiculous, or even that they are the sort of like minority interests of certain group. No, it's all the same interest, and as long as you have the sort of minorities or the minority cultural groups sort of trying to separate themselves. I mean, if you look at America, you do kind of have that, but you don't have like usually you have the sort of minority groups in the sort of Democratic Party, but well, one, it didn't used to be like that, and two, there isn't as much. It's not that much straightforward. Oftentimes, you have certain minority groups more aligning themselves with a different political party. Even us in Slovakia, while we still do have certain problems when we have sort of our Hungarian groups, you do have like the more sort of like liberal Hungarian and the sort of more conservative Hungarian. And throughout Slovak history of a few decades, they generally sort of went from different sides based on which the way their own groups was moving. It wasn't like always it was just one party, right? And that's you cannot promote more or your answer to sort of ethnic oppression or sort of oppression of certain groups cannot be no, we need to actually think of ourselves in a groups, we just need to have protections for those groups. You need to realize, at the end of the day it's individuals. And also you cannot have protections for all groups because there are infinite amount of groups. You can always make sort of like more groups, you can always create more, these, well, yeah, all of these are Druze, but these are sort of like the Damascus Druze, and these are sort of like a Golan Druze. They're different, so they need sort of like a different standard. No, it's they are all individuals, and they can all be if Syria was truly, if the Syrian president was truly sort of committed to actual sort of building of a modern state rather than, and I recommend people actually reading the constitution. I think it talks about social justice in the constitution itself, which is always really interesting to see used as a language. And even when it talks about sort of like defense of sort of these group rights, it actually has no mechanism to sort of like even do that. So it's also funny to like just because you write something in a paper, it is just a, sort of like an empty line unless you have processes to oversure that that actually gets fulfilled, like right, that actually gets protected. And yeah, this like people in the chat are talking about is Syria a failed state? And I mean, it was for a long time. I mean, this it's simply not working out. It's simply, and I don't think it can ever, unless something like fundamentally changes. And that is sort of the biggest problem with the Middle East, right? It's talking about Israel versus the Palestine. It's if Palestinians wanted to live side by side with Israelis, if they didn't want to simply kill them, if they accepted sort of rule of law, accepted individual rights, accepted property rights, two states, one state, who cares? It wouldn't matter because it would be basically the same thing. And that's for most of the Middle East. It's just a bunch of tribes sort of who took over, like literal tribes who took over. Saudi Arabia, for those who don't know, the Saudi stands for the Saudi family because Abdulaziz Ibn Saud, I think he was the first one. Like went on a horse or went on a camel, I'm not sure what they used more, and took over a bunch of area, united a bunch of tribes, and managed to sort of control a bunch of territory. So now we simply recognize that that family is controlling the territory, right? It's that there is no ideal, there is no sort of individual rights or sort of a nation built upon some idea. It's just a warlord took some part of Arabia and was able to establish a kingdom that we sort of recognized because why would we have any moral standard when it comes to sort of recognizing states, right?
Well, that's exactly it. You know, Ayn Rand, the philosopher, got it exactly right. When people are no longer conceptual, when they no longer look at government in a principled way, what are they left with? They're left with the perceptual level. They're left with these tribal identifications. You belong to this tribe, I belong to this tribe. Look at it even within the Muslim world in the Middle East. Oh, you're a Sunni, you're a Shia, you're a, you know, you come from, and you point out the origins of Saudi Arabia. There were other Arab Muslims they were fighting, and they talk about tribalism. I mean, it came down to tribalism. Okay, the king of Jordan, you're over there. The king of Saudi Arabia is over here. And what are we doing? We're in effect compromising between different tribes and letting the tribes run things. And well, how do they run it without principle, without secular philosophical principles like individual rights? The government exists for one purpose, and that is to ban physical force in their society, to protect the individual against criminal violence, to protect and force, but and to protect the country from international aggression. It is force. Government is the army. Government is the police, as Ayn Rand understood. In effect, government is a gun. And the only moral use of that gun is to protect people from the initiation of force in a responsive way. I highly recommend people read The Nature of Government, an article by Ayn Rand, and Man's Rights, an article by Ayn Rand, in which she gives a full-throated defense of the Enlightenment idea of individual rights. Now, it requires that we go up to the conceptual level to understand that. When you're in a savage, mystic context, we refuse on principle any rational conceptual principles of this kind. What are you left with? You're left with racism, you're left with religious bigotry, you're left with tribalism. And soon it breaks down to the most, the smallest tribal units, if you want, at a certain point. And otherwise, the government oppresses the religious minorities that are under their control. And so if there's a valid Syrian government, the way it would approach it is no violence against Druze, no violence against Kurds, Christians, the Shia. There's no violence based on someone's ideology or fact that someone blasphemes. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of religion. That means that your religious views may get offended. Your political views may get offended. Guess what? Words are words. Force, physical force is physical force. You have to accept the idea that there's going to be offensive speech. You have to accept the idea that there are going to be religious ideas that you disagree with strongly practiced in your country. The only valid government that there can be, the only moral kind of government there can be, is a government that respects individual rights. Now, given to some extent at least, the reality in Syria makes that utterly impossible. Why? Ideas control history. And the ideas that we in the West have fled from, the notion of individual rights, the notion of the freedom of mind, of the human mind, to believe what you, in your best judgment, is the truth and to act on it, that is sacred. I'm an atheist. If I was to call something sacred, I would say the sacred thing is a government that protects the mind, the individual mind, in believing what it chooses, what it's in its own best judgment to believe and to act on it. That kind of freedom is essential to legitimacy, moral legitimacy. Now, as I say, good on Israel insofar as they're defending uh, uh, the rights of Druze, but it's a foreign country. At the end of the day, Syria has to get its own act together. And the West should be far more demanding, as you point out, far more demanding that these minorities, that their rights get respected, not as groups, not as groups, not because you're a Shia or a Druze or a Christian. It doesn't matter whether you're a Kurd or Arab. Shouldn't matter. The individual's right to think and act, so long as he doesn't violate the rights of someone else, is what's imperative. Now, I know that's kind of a liberal idea, and therefore has a very slim chance of succeeding anywhere in the Muslim world. But if we in the West got our act together and understood what makes the West great, what makes the West great is that we have freedom of individual rights. We have freedom of religion. People can believe and worship and think, whether they're atheist. This is really twist their heads if I were to say this. Hey, atheists have a right too in Syria. Only a government that would respect the rights of atheists can be legitimate. If we in the West had that attitude, where we understood that it was an individual right and the limited role that a legitimate government has, can we then turn around and say, no, so long as you guys will tolerate violence against the Druze, we cannot recognize you. So long as you build that into your system, so long as your motivation is in effect religious oppression, tribalism is the essence of your approach. They must abandon tribalism as their essential approach. Now, that is a tall order. I do not expect that to happen. In this cultural context, the West can't even stand up for the Lockean rights and what was called by Locke religious toleration. But it was after centuries, not just centuries of internecine religious warfare in Europe between Catholics and Protestants and some Protestant groups versus other Protestant groups. It was all of this bloody battle between these religious groups that caused a self-awareness of it, but only because they'd accepted a wider philosophy that was pro-reason in the 17th and 18th centuries. Absent that wider recognition of the role of reason, it's hopeless. But I would urge them to consider the founding of America, Lockean rights, what makes Britain and France superior to other places in the world, an attempt at tolerance, religiously speaking. Now, that doesn't mean bending over backwards and allowing your Islamic groups to engage in violence or have some kind of self-rule that oppresses individual rights within their little enclaves. No, even Europe is collapsing, you see, in the wake of tribalism. Tribalism, a perceptual level mentality, is prevailing even in the West. So how can we expect it in Syria today? I know that sounds very pessimistic, but that's the reality. So Israel needs to focus exclusively on its security interests, it seems to me. That does mean that the ability of the ruling government in Damascus to engage in force in the south against Druze minorities, that is part of Israel's security right now. And that's what Israel needs to focus on. Make sure that Syria is not an aggressive military threat in the region, and controlled by some religious sectarian group at the expense of all the others.
Yeah, and somebody or people in the chat are talking about that Balkanization might not always be the bad thing. Even if you go to the region of Balkans, it sort of helped them to sort of separate themselves. But that is like a surrendering. I mean, ask India what, like, if you have a place that couldn't be Balkanized more than India with their, I mean, I don't know, like hundreds of languages, maybe even, and the different sort of not only different groups, different like sort of like societal sort of accepted groups. I mean, that's one place that could be sort of more balkanized than ever, but it didn't. So didn't America. So did so many other places, many other countries didn't. This idea that you know somebody speaks a different language, somebody has a different culture, whatever it means. So that means we have to start killing each other, and we have to start separate in our own sort of like cubicles. It can only come from statism. It can only come from, because when you want freedom, when you want to simply let people live, let you know, laissez-faire, let us do. Then you don't care if the guy in charge is a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh or whatever religion or an atheist or whatever culture, right? Because they cannot enforce anything. It's only when you want to sort of enforce some cultural ideas or some like societal sort of changes that's when this amount of sectarian violence starts. So yeah, anybody like once you have this, and you know, Ayn Rand has the essay Global Balkanization. Once people sort of like that's such a surrender. Once we start killing each other, once we start sort of separating based on groups, that's when you like, you know, look at the Balkans. Is that like an example of like a modern a way of like how to have this perfect government and how to have this like perfect states? You know, after they balkanized themselves, did they, you know, found this like new freedom they've been yearning for?
Well, in the European context, it's because the rest of Europe doesn't want them to be at each other's throats in the literal Balkans. I mean, the very cause of say World War One was Serbian national. The proximate cause was Serbian nationalism, and they wanted out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when you throw in the towel, if you, we could, I suppose, in the short run, and this is what I want to emphasize this, in the short run, you might imagine, okay, we'll have a small Kurdish state up in the north. We'll have in the southeast, we'll have a small Druze state. Maybe we'll have another state, you know, somewhere else. But you know, we break it up into states based on religions and ethnicities. You know, what a slippery concept that is. We break it up. You're throwing in the towel. You're making the giant ideological concession that countries should exist for tribal reasons, that religious differences are so significant that we can't even have the same country. No, that is a concession, and therefore only a short-term solution. How long will it be before this Kurdish country in the north and this Druze small enclave in the south get invaded and attacked? Because if you're going to be consistent, you're going to be consistent with your, Sunni Muslim attitude. It means it is intolerable that we have any enclave of anyone who might have a different race, a different language, a different religion. No, it has to be looked at from the standpoint, as you observed so well in the beginning, from the individual. The smallest minority is the individual. Are there differences of opinion among Jews about what's going on in Israel? Yes. Are there differences of opinion even among Arab Muslims in my country, in the United States, where they have some freedom of speech about this? Yes. Are there differences of opinion between Druze? Let's say some Druze leader gets included in the Syrian government. Okay, well, that'll satisfy a small group of Druze people. And there's a bunch of other Druze over here saying, no, we need the freedom to practice and speak and offend Muhammad, commit blasphemy. And that's the thing they have to swallow. They have to swallow hard. My consistent Muslim friends, I put in quotes, you have to swallow hard and accept the fact that a civilized country permits your religion to be offended. People offend my philosophy every day in my country. People say anti-objectivist things all the time. I'm an atheist. I have a certain philosophy. That philosophy gets offended on a daily basis in my country. I accept that because far more important to me is the freedom to think and the freedom to act on my thinking as an individual. That's the level it has to be understood at and enforced. But as I say, they have a model. You know, it's not a perfect model, but at least they have a model in the area, and that is the state of Israel. As you point out, if people were like Israel, if their neighboring states were like Israel, it wouldn't matter, really, would it? Oh, who cares if there's a two-state solution, a three-state solution, a one-state solution? Everyone has the right to practice and act on their own religion, even if that offends other people. That's how you have to understand this. Now, and truly though, the real enemy is religion. It is mysticism, because mysticism destroys the rational capacity. It tells you that the important truths are not to be arrived at by reason. And so, as I say, once you've gotten rid of the conceptual faculty, you're down to the perceptual level. He has a different mystical belief than I have. He is from a different racial group than I am. You're down to that level. Faith and force, since we're recommending Ayn Rand articles, faith and force, destroyers of the modern world. Faith and force are friends. Reason is what works to persuade. When you've rejected reason, you've rejected, in effect, the basis for freedom. It is the operation of reason for which freedom is required. Freedom is necessary so that people can think for themselves and act on their own best judgment. Faith and force, in contrast, go hand in hand. If it's down to your mystical beliefs versus my mystical beliefs, expect the clubs and the guns to come out. Violence is the partner, the handmaiden of mysticism. Ayn Rand had a beautiful metaphor. The Attila and the witch doctor are always in this state of needing one another in this alliance. The guy who wants to rule by force and the guy who wants to rule your mind through mysticism. They are partners in crime. And we can see it playing out in the Middle East today. But as I say, there is at least a model in the area that they can go by. Israel. Why don't you just have the same degree of religious tolerance and individual rights as Israel has? That would solve the problem. Protect everybody's rights. Protect the rights of a Druze blasphemer. That's a huge swallow for Muslims in the Middle East today. That's a hard one for them to accept. I fully understand why, because they are absolutely deprived of any kind of rational philosophy. And so what we call religious tolerance since the Enlightenment, using John Locke's, I don't particularly like the word tolerance because you're tolerating something you don't. No, the West does is it liberates reason with freedom. With individual rights, it liberates the mind. But that's exactly what religious fanatics don't want. They don't want free speech. They don't want freedom of religion because that would liberate people to use their own judgment. And if the government really only banned physical force, banned the oppression of religious minorities, however they might offend some other group, do you have civilization? I would say, in fact, I would equate modern civilization with the acceptance of that idea. To the extent it does not accept that idea, you can see what you get. Religious theocracies, religious rule, most consistently, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But you can see it all over, from the Taliban to Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan. I mean, you bring up a really great point. Well, how is it that in the United States, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus of all varieties live in peace with one another? It's because the government is secular. The government says nobody can use force against anybody, even if they're offending your religious belief. Now, we'll protect you in your religious practice insofar as you don't use force and violate other people's rights, but you've got to accept the same for everybody else. Once you lose that cultural ideal, that political ideal, it's a slippery slope down back into the Dark Ages. What were the Dark Ages? I mean, if you were a variant Christian heretical sect, they would wipe you out like the Cathars or something. Or consider the Protestants and Catholics at each other's throats in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's what you're rolling out the welcome mat for that kind of sectarian violence. And the only alternative is a philosophy of reason, a philosophy of individual rights, a philosophy that says a person can think, speak, practice his religion or lack of religion altogether, even if it offends other people, so long as he does not initiate force against anyone else. Their equal right to do exactly the same thing.
We have a super chat from PC. Thank you so much. He says Syria has been messed up for a long time. definitely. And another
Well,
super
what
chat from
happens is you
PC.
keep a lid. An authoritarian dictatorship like the Assad regime can make it seem like, in America, it looks like it's just chaos. And because we've got all this freedom of speech and diversity of opinion, that can look chaotic. Look at an American political process. It may look chaotic, but what's the option? An authoritarian regime keeping a lid on the differences of opinion that exist within the society. And that can look from the outside like greater stability, but it is, in fact, a mechanism of oppression whereby minorities are have their rights complete. And the smallest minority, as Ayn Rand points out, is the individual. Individuals have their rights violated. Violence will happen. Sectarian violence. What you're seeing now is what happens when the lid gets taken off and the different groups go back to being at one another's throats. Those are your options, ladies and gentlemen. Freedom and all the complexities and offense to your religious beliefs and philosophical beliefs that allowed to be given voice in your country, or authoritarianism, theocracy, oppression. That's the choice. It's that stark.
And we have one more super chat from PC. Thank you so much. He says, James, I was born into an Ashkenazi Orthodox family, but I'm an atheist now. With that, James, any last thoughts from you?
Good for you. That's all I can say. It is religious minorities such as the Jews. I mean, if it weren't for America's experience, I really think that so many of the people who came to what the United States is today were escaping religious oppression, seeking religious freedom. That gave them a greater appreciation for the importance of this. It's unfortunate that oppressed groups such as Jews in Europe, Ashkenazi Jews, the oppression is unfortunate, but the result is very often a greater appreciation for the importance of individual rights and freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religious practice. Those are critical freedoms in any civilized nation.
And with that, thank you everybody for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of the Daily Objective. Until then, thank you, James, for joining me. Thank you everybody for watching, and bye-bye.
Be safe.